My name is David Surrey, and I've been working with credit unions for the past 16 years via Quick Rates. We also have Stephen Huntington on the line, and he is our Director of Quick Analytics with 20 plus years of experience of working with financial institutions. All right, let's talk about CECL. What's wrong with the incurred loss model? One of the comments we hear on our demos is, what's wrong with the incurred loss model? Why the change? This all goes back to the last crisis. And in FASB's opinion, they felt that the incurred loss model did a disservice to financial institutions by allowing them to not acknowledge losses until they were probable. The approach used to recognize impairment losses on financial assets has long been identified as a major weakness, resulting in a delayed recognition of those losses. So at this point, FASB had a couple of options: either fix the methodology or do nothing. And if you do nothing and the problem reoccurs, then you do leave yourself open and exposed to hearing, well, why didn't you do anything to fix the problem? So clearly FASB decided that that was not going to be their solution. So they decided to fix it, and CECL is that fix. This means learning a new way to calculate your reserve. At the end of the day, we're just calculating a reserve, a single number. We like to say we're playing the same game, just with a new set of rules. We're still going to focus on reserves. We're just going to go about it in a slightly different manner. So let's talk about some of those changes. I think you'll see here that there are a number of areas where CECL and the CECLSolver tool can feel very similar to things we've done in the past with the incurred loss methodology. And one of the reasons we like the WARM methodology is its similarities to the incurred loss model. First, CECL will be different in that we'll be looking at losses over a longer life of the loan approach, instead of looking at losses over an annual or a couple of year look back period that most institutions do now with their ALLL. Now you'll make allowance for all of the losses over the life of the loan pool. So there are several similarities. We're still going to look at a pool of assets, make Q factor adjustments, and make assumptions to justifying those Q factor adjustments. So we're going to build on some of those similarities, but make a few slight changes along the way. There is no one mandatory method for calculating your reserve under CECL. NCUA has mentioned several different methodologies like the WARM method, but the choice is completely up to you. You choose your path, and you'll have to defend this to the examiner and absolutely understand where your final reserve number is coming from. And of course, document this appropriately. This will be the case for any tool or partner you choose. NCUA has also stated that your chosen reserve methodology should match the complexity of the portfolio. For most traditional credit unions under a few billion in asset size, a call report driven analysis using the WARM methodology will be perfectly acceptable. You do not need to engage in highly complex modeling or loan level analysis. When it comes to implementing CECL, there are some practical considerations. First, how much data have you collected? Do you have detailed loan level data going back at least 5 years? To do a more complex loan level analysis, you'll need to have this data collected and reconciled before you even start your first actual reserve calculation, a process that can take a couple of years. For other WARM options, What is the actual cost? Is it Excel based? How much actual work do you think you'll have to allocate to calculate your reserve? Free options might not cost you money, but tend to be expensive when it comes to your time. How about data from outside your credit union? What have the loss trends been in your state? How do your losses compare? Having good internal data is important, but having comparable peer data will be very helpful, especially in areas where you have little to no losses. Peer data can help to establish reasonable and supportable CECL reserves and further support your reserve figures. In the end, we feel that CECLSolver hits that perfect balance of simplicity and automation while still giving you the ability to add complexity where needed. Very beginning, we saw the original guidance for CECL. The guidance was for more complex, more massive institutions, and we knew that that would not work for most of our credit unions. We set out to create a CECL tool that was easy to use, collected the relevant data for you, and to create a CECL tool that was just easy to understand and follow. We also wanted to create a CECL solution that was quick to implement and easy to maintain from month to month or quarter to quarter. We feel we've done exactly this with our CECLSolver tool for credit unions, which brings us to this live demo. And with that said, I'll turn the presentation over to Steve.
Thank you, David. If you can go ahead and make me presenter so I can share my screen. Give me just a moment, everybody, while we do that. Let me know when that's popped up and visible for you, David.
Yes, sir, it has.
Excellent. Thanks again, everybody. Thank you, David, for introducing us and getting the ball rolling here. So today we're going to do a walkthrough of our CECLSolver tool. What you see on the screen before you is the summary page for when you first log into the tool. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit, make it a little bit more readable for everybody. But as David mentioned, there's lots of different methodologies that have been put out there by various accounting firms and vetted by not only FASB, but also the NCUA. One of the more straightforward methodologies is what they call the WARM method. There's not one specific there's not a WARM method, so to speak, that has been, quote, approved by the NCUA or by FASB. They weren't really being prescriptive when they did come out with the CECL standard. And so it's really up to you guys what methodology you want to choose. It's really all about making reasonable assumptions and then being able to justify them. We thought a WARM-based or a WARM-like methodology was going to be the most appropriate for the vast majority of the credit unions around the country that we deal with, which is number in the hundreds with our CECL tool. And so that was the approach that we took in designing our tool. What you see in front of you here, again, is the couple things to keep in mind as we're walking through our tool. Our entire tool lives in the cloud. What that means is the first time you ever log in, it has already connected to all of your historical data from balances to charge-offs, recoveries, and past dues by bucket or by call report code. And so that we really already have a fully fleshed out historical data on not just your credit union, but on your entire peer group. And I'll talk in a couple minutes about what I mean by your peer group. But suffice to say that most of you on the call today probably have at least one, if not more, segments of your portfolio that really just hasn't seen much in the way of losses in the recent past. And yet we know we still need to justify having a reasonable reserve, even if we don't have any losses that might explain the need for it in the recent past. That's where we need to go. I wouldn't say look outside the box, but we certainly have to look outside of our four walls to the environment around us, whether it be the economic environment or whether it just be the experience of other similar credit unions around your state or around your region, so we can get a feel for how do we justify your 80 basis point reserve on your commercial loans, for example, if you haven't had any losses on them in the last 6 years. Because we know you're not going to be able to justify having zero reserves just because you've had zero losses. And so our entire tool, living in the online environment that it does, not only is it preloaded with all of your historical data so that you really spend your time focusing on the subjective aspects of CECL, the qualitative factors and those opinions and assumptions that have to come from management. But also, since it lives in the cloud, like you see here on the screen, every time you make any change in input or assumption to the tool, the entire tool recalculates instantaneously, pretty much on the fly. And what that means is, if you feel you need to change a qualitative factor adjustment, or you redo a recalculation of your warm for a particular bucket, or make any other adjustments, you can see in real time exactly what impact, if any, that it's going to have on your total reserve. And that's just a huge time saver, because the whole idea here is that we've seen many tools out there, many systems out there that ask for literally hundreds of inputs or assumptions on the front end, and you have to plug all those assumptions in, and then you have to run the report, so to speak, and then get some sort of output, whether it's printed, whether it's a PDF, and then you see exactly what impact the sum of all those elements had. But it becomes very difficult when you make a bunch of changes using scientific method, to identify which change really had an impact and which one was pretty irrelevant given your situation. And so you end up going down that rabbit hole of tweaking 50 different things to figure out which one actually matters and which ones don't. That is not an issue or a problem using our tool. As soon as you change any one of the inputs or assumptions, you can see immediately what impact that's going to have. And so you don't need to spend hours and days, sharpening the point on one specific assumption, if no matter what the result of that assumption is, you're not going to see much difference in your overall reserve. So the way we've designed the tool, we hope it's very time saving from that perspective. But let's take a step back and just kind of dig through the tool and see how it works on a step-by-step basis. You'll notice that we start our segmentation, at least by default, around the buckets or the segments that we can get from the call reports. That used to be 10 or 11 total segments. And now, after March 31st of this year, we have a lot more granularity available to us on the commercial side. So now we've got 20 totally discrete, completely additive segments by default for our tool. Now, there is the ability to add custom segmentation if and when necessary. If you need to take a call report bucket and split it into two separate buckets because of some differences that you have within the loans in that call report bucket, or because of your past experience or what have you. So the tool does have the flexibility to back certain balances out of the predefined call report buckets and add custom segmentation. But we do want to stick within the call report buckets as much as is humanly possible. And the reason is because not only do we have, for simplicity and efficiency, because we have all that data going back, multiple decades, but also because a big part of the process here is going to be our qualitative factor adjustments, is going to be looking at our historical experience and seeing how do we need to modify that for our expectations going forward, given the environment that we're in. And as soon as we diverge from the public realm and we're looking at all these custom segments, it feels more granular. So you might think it's getting more precise and more accurate, but what we're doing is we're also losing the ability to have any apples to apples external data that can affect our Q factors. Meaning, as soon as we go outside the realm of the publicly available buckets, there is no comparable peer data. So we can't look outside our four walls and really look at what's happening in the environment for that specific segment anymore. So for all those reasons, we start our segmentation around what is available on the call reports. And the first big step, and that's the only one that we need some data help from you guys on the front end, is doing some calculations around the weighted average remaining maturity. It's called the warm method for a reason, because it is highly sensitive to the weighted average remaining maturity, or the warm calculation. But warm calculations are not specific to only that methodology. In fact, no matter what methodology you end up ultimately choosing to satisfy CECL, you can't get around having to do warm calculations on all your segments of your portfolio, because CECL at its heart is about estimating losses over the remaining lives of the assets. We cannot do that unless we have a feel for what the remaining lives of our assets are. And so that's where the WARM calculations come in. Unfortunately for us, the WARM calculations are not something that's available to us publicly speaking, right? Nowhere on that 5300 call report does it ask you guys to calculate WARMs on each of your call report segments of your portfolio. So we need some assistance from you guys in doing those WARM calculations. Now, the easiest thing to do would certainly be to just call your ALM provider and say, hey, can you run a report for me that has my WARM calculations by call report segment? Sometimes that's possible, and that's certainly the easiest solution to that if it is, but we typically don't hold our breath for most ALM providers to be able to offer that to you guys. So rest assured, as much help or assistance as you need in calculating the WARMs on the front end, we can provide. Whether it's just providing an Excel-based spreadsheet, which we have right here, and I'll click on it so you can see what that looks like. This is an Excel tool that shows you exactly what you would need to do, what loan level data you would need in order to, that's not it, there we go, in order to calculate a WARM by call report bucket on your own. So the only information that you really need is balance and maturity data information, at least for the majority of your portfolio. With those two pieces of information, you can do a bunch of cutting and pasting into a spreadsheet like this, and you can do a WARM, a weighted average remaining maturity calculation, an unadjusted or stated one. Then you can overlay some sort of a prepayment estimate on top of that to get a prepayment adjusted weighted average remaining maturity, which is the value that we want from a CECL perspective in calculating losses over the remaining lives of the assets. This is an Excel spreadsheet that you can take and use and save internally, do whatever you want with, if that's the way you want to do the WARM calculations. Now, if you don't have the resources or just don't like doing the WARM calculations or dealing with it, that's something you can offload onto us as well. If that would entail you guys connecting securely to our server so that you can upload your loan level data, whether it's the Aries file or some combination of Aries and other internal loan data. And then we can go through the information, we can slice it, dice it, cut it, and paste it, and pretty much build this spreadsheet where each segment of the portfolio has a different tab, and we have prepayment assumptions that you can still modify, and then we do the WARM calculations here for you, and then you can take this data and you can input it into your tool. So whether you want us to do the WARM calculations, whether you want to do it or with our assistance, or whether you can get it from elsewhere, that's the first step in utilizing our tool, or honestly complying with CECL no matter what methodology. Once you've got that managed, then we have all the data that we need to really calculate the first half of CECL. And the first half is really looking at your historical experience on a segment by segment basis and getting a feel for what kind of losses your institution has had, not on an annual or annualized basis, as David was talking about, but on a life of loan basis. So for example, let's pick a guinea pig for today. This is a pretty big, I believe, Wisconsin-based credit union that you see the data for here on the screen. But if we were focusing on new vehicle loans, and let's say that we calculated the average remaining maturity of new vehicle loans was 3.5 years, or 3.5. As soon as I type in 3.5 here, it takes about 2 seconds, and then everything just recalculated on the fly across the board for new vehicle loans as it pertains to CECL. And what I mean by all that is, if we know that the average remaining life of our new vehicle loans is 3.5 years, we know that what CECL is really requiring of us is that we project right now 3.5 years worth of potential future losses on that segment of the portfolio, losses over the remaining lives of the assets. So in order to do that, in order to project 3.5 years worth of future losses, we start by taking a symmetrical view from a look back period standpoint, meaning we're going to look at an actual 3.5-year period in your history and analyze your experience. How have your balances changed in new vehicle loans over the last 3.5 years? How many charge-offs have you accumulated? What direction are those charge-offs headed in? Have you had any recoveries? And we take all that historical information to calculate what is that first big piece of the puzzle, and that is, what is our credit union's historical lifetime loss rate on that segment. So you see, for this particular sample credit union, for new vehicle loans over a 3.5-year look back, 35 basis points is the aggregate lifetime loss rate. Now, there is a ton of data that goes into this calculation right here. But lucky for us and for you, it's all relatively straightforward because the warm method is pretty straightforward in general, and our take on it is very straightforward as well. All of the supporting information that you need, or almost all of the supporting information you need, is right here in the historical analysis tab. So when I click on that, I can see all the same segmentation. So here are all your call report segments, non-commercial and commercial. And we're going to look at balances, charge-offs, recoveries, net charge-offs, and net charge-off ratio. And again, first time you ever log into the system, all this data will already be here for your credit union. And every time you file a call report, at the end of that first month after the quarter's over, your data will be uploaded automatically in here, and we'll let you know the week that that's happening. Typically, well, probably next Monday, I believe, our entire tool and database will be completely updated for September 30th data. So not only do you not have to upload and all of your historical data on a one-time basis to get the tool up and running because it's already there, but on an ongoing basis, it's also taken care of for you. But you can see here, we've highlighted all the look back period. We've shaded them all in blue so you can visually get a sense for what areas of your portfolio have a longer duration, and therefore we want to go back further in history to consider losses, and we have to project further out into the future, since again, CECL is about lifetime losses, right? So looking at the example of new vehicle loans over 3.5 years, we've highlighted the last 3.5 years here, and we can see that balances have come down a little bit. They've averaged about just over 50 million over the last 3.5 years. And so then if I scroll down here, I can take a look at net charge-offs or charge-offs and recoveries in dollar amounts. And then what's really important down here is obviously where the rubber meets the road, the net charge-off ratio. And so we see for new vehicle loans over 3.5 years, this is how you've accumulated charge-offs, and your aggregate lifetime loss rate for the portfolio or for the segment is 35 basis points. So if I head back up to the summary, that's where our 35 basis points come from. So everything that we do in the tool is completely trackable, traceable, and auditable on just a couple screens. And if you ever need any additional assistance with some of the behind the scenes numbers and where they're coming from to match it up to the call reports historically, we can always provide that on a one-off basis if you need more details. But once we have that, then we kind of embark on the second half of CECL. All right, we now know what our historical lifetime loss rate is. And if the future were to be identical to the past, this would be what we would need to provide for CECL for our new vehicle loans, in our allowance, in our ACL now, I guess is what we're calling it. But future never is exactly like the past, right? So now we need to come up with the reasons why we think things might be a little bit different going forward and justify them. So we need sort of a matrix to manage this. And that's where we click on the Q Factors tab. This is the tab where we're going to manage all of those adjustments to our historical loss rate, right? For what we really expect moving forward. So here's our new vehicle loans again. There's our historical 35 basis points. And this is where we start adding in those Q factors. So we've kind of preloaded the system, so to speak, with all of those typical custom qualitative or suggested qualitative factors that we've had in the interagency guidance for decades now. And where these suggested Q factors come from, I believe a footnote right down here. This is probably familiar to most of you on the call. There's a document that they put out a couple decades ago, interagency policy statement for allowance on loan and lease losses. And in this document, they suggest all the typical qualitative factor adjustments that you should at least consider in your reserve. And so we've kind of faithfully recreated them down here. Now, you can certainly say that, listen, we haven't had any changes in our loan review system in the last 7 years. So we're not going to make any adjustments based upon that. You can remove a Q factor adjustment. You can, if you haven't had any changes in your lending management and staff or portfolio mix, you can remove some of these suggested Q factor adjustments. If you have custom Q factor adjustments here that you'd like to add in, it's fully flexible from that perspective. Let's say you changed your staff was already, lending management and staff is already a suggested one. Let's say you made an acquisition 5 or 6 years ago and the institution that you acquired had some higher losses in certain segments, but now that you've sort of taken over and have a different staff and different management, you don't believe those losses are quite as indicative moving forward, you can have a custom adjustment based upon, old loans from acquired credit union, for example. So you can add in all those custom Q factors and manage these ones as you see fit. But as you make any changes in here to the individual Q factors, the total or the net adjustment recalculates on the fly, and then that recalculates everything on the summary here. So for example, if we're using our used vehicle loans or our new vehicle loans as an example, let's say we made a 10 basis point adjustment based upon the fact that our peers have had a much higher loss rate than we have for a while now, and we think in the future our losses might be a little bit more closely aligned with our peer average than they have been in the past. So we can make an adjustment here. And let's say we make a couple other adjustments here and here. As I'm making these adjustments, you'll notice that not only is the net adjustment changing, but this entire chart is updating on the fly. And this chart here is a great visual summary of everything that's going on in CECL. I can click throughout the portfolio and I can get a feel for what, for example, for mortgage loans. The blue bars are our credit union's long-term trend in losses. The green line is our peer group's average or weighted average trend in losses over time. The gray shaded area is the look back period that we're using by default to start estimating CECL requirements. And then the orange line is a total CECL estimate given all the inputs that we have. So as we change Q factor adjustments, as we change WARMs, these charts here will update on the fly to give you a good visual representation of what your trends have looked like historically and what your expectation of potential future losses looks like. And as I head back to the summary results here, as I made those changes in the Q factors tab, they were immediately reflected here. So anytime you make any changes anywhere throughout the tool, all these tabs are synced and linked instantaneously. So you don't have to worry about things being apples to oranges or not comparable or updating things elsewhere in the tool. We also have some economic data that you can sort of overlay over your loss experience in the past to get a feel for whether you see any significant implication from economic trends that you want to take into account from that perspective. Now, heading back to the summary, once we've taken all those Q factor adjustments into account, and we've made those adjustments here, then we've effectively arrived at an expected future lifetime loss rate, because that is simply our historical experience plus or minus the sum total of all the changes that we think might happen to it is equal to our expectation for the future. Once we have that expected future lifetime loss rate, let's say for the new vehicle loans, 35 basis points historical, peers are much higher than that. Peers have had much higher losses within the state or the region. And then we're adding some Q factors. And so we have a 65 basis point lifetime loss expectation moving forward. The last thing we want to do is apply that expected future loss rate to our current portfolio balance. Now, by default, these current balances are going to be what you had on your last call report. The only information, publicly speaking, that we have available to us is the quarterly call report. However, that does not in any way limit how often you run this tool or when you run it as of. You can certainly come in here and take these quarter end balances that were, let's say, 9/30 and update them for yesterday's GL so that the CECL calculation is as of yesterday. And so that's what we've done here. We come in here, updated these balances. You can also, you'll notice, modify these balances. Not only make them current as of whatever date you'd like, but also net out any balances that you don't think are CECL is applicable to. And that would include anything that's really outside the scope of CECL completely. If you have a bunch of loans that are held for sale on the books at fair market value, for example, that's outside of the scope of CECL. If you have any significant government guaranteed balances, whether it's SBA portfolio loans that have a government guarantee, whether you have any lingering PPP or COVID loans that are government guaranteed, and even if you have a sizable portfolio of fully share secured loans, really any balances in your portfolio that if there were a loss for some reason, it wouldn't be coming out of your pocket, or at least it wouldn't be coming out of the reserve. we don't need to set aside reserve for. So we want to net those balances out, and then we can make a note of it. For example, you can come here to the notes section and say, hey, we netted out $1 million in our all other unsecured loans because they are fully share secured and have no loss liability. And you can make those notes there. That brings up another good point. At multiple places throughout this tool, not only on the summary tab, but also most notably on the Q factors tab, we have areas where you can make notes. This is a hugely important from a best practices standpoint. It's more important probably what you type into your narrative about your adjustments than it is what the actual adjustment is, right? From a percentage standpoint. So this is where you can start building that narrative, giving your justification for, hey, as of September 30th, these are the adjustments that I made, and these are the reasons why we made those adjustments. As soon as you make those notes, they get attached to that risk pool, to that segment throughout the analysis. Whenever you print it off, whenever you export it, those notes get attached to the PDF or to the export or to the print job, so that not only from an audit trail and an exam standpoint, but also just internally, right? So when you come back in here next quarter and you're double checking and see which Q factors are still appropriate and which ones need to be modified, you've got your paper trail, so to speak, and you know exactly what you were thinking last quarter when you made these adjustments, and then you can appropriately modify it. So it just helps you keep your ducks in a row and helps remind you and your examiners and auditors of what you were thinking and what's been going on. Heading back to the summary, once we've made any adjustments there, the last thing we need to think about are individually assessed loans. So if you have any loans that are, let's say, default is imminent, and you have a pretty good idea of what kind of a loss you might see, and you don't feel like that loan still has any similar risk characteristics to any other loan in your portfolio or in the call report bucket, and you have to cull that loan from the herd, so to speak. It's what we would have called the old specific reserve, right? In our current methodologies, we have a general reserve for our healthier loans, and we have a specific reserve for individual loans that are less healthy. That concept still exists under CECL. The threshold where you need to use that concept is definitely not the same under CECL. In fact, a lot of the thresholds we would currently use, the TDR threshold or the old impairment threshold, the TDR threshold is going the way of the dodo come January 1st, so we won't be even reporting TDRs anymore. And the old concept of when a loan becomes impaired is also going to be a different threshold next year, because we don't have the same accounting language for FAS 5 and FAS 114 that as we will next year. FAS 5 and FAS 114 cease to exist and are replaced with the CECL standard come January 1st for pretty much everybody on the call. But if you have some loans you want to individually assess and deal with, we have a spot for where you can do that. You just let us know the details and let us know what call report bucket it's coming from, so we're not double counting losses on that loan or those loans. And this is where it would play back into the summary. And once we've done all that, we can do some pretty basic, straightforward math and come up with a CECL requirement for each segment of the portfolio. We add them all up. We get a total CECL reserve on the collective pool. We add in any reserve for the individually assessed loans that we calculated separately here. And then there's also a space for a shortfall for unfunded commitments. So under CECL, FASB in their infinite wisdom has decided that we need to calculate a potential CECL reserve on our unfunded commitments completely separately from our existing portfolio. Now, it's all a little bit hypothetical here. I don't want anyone to get too concerned about this if you've never heard about it. It's a very small piece of the puzzle from a dollar perspective for the vast majority of credit unions out there. There's not a lot of great guidance on it, but we have been able to put together a methodology that'll help get you through it. Again, it's a small piece of the puzzle, and it's you have to jump through some mental hoops to get there, because what they're asking you to do in effect is estimate potential long-term losses on loans that don't even really exist yet, right? So that starts by looking at what your net unfunded commitment is, And we can get that data from the call reports. And then we work with you to figure out what portion of your unfunded commitments are what they would consider to be unconditionally cancelable and don't have to be worried about from a CECL perspective. Once we net those out, we have what's left over. That's your net unfunded commitment. That's a number that we have to deal with from a CECL perspective. And this is where we have to start jumping through those mental hoops. We have to estimate what the likelihood of funding is for those unfunded commitments, and then for how long you have those commitments. And then if they were to be funded, what kind of losses might we see on them? Luckily, we have some very good data from the analysis that we just completed on what kind of losses you might see on your actual funded loans. So we give you some good default values here to help guide you through this part of the process. And we help you calculate any sort of reserve or allowance that you need on your off-balance sheet credit exposures. Now, this is a line item that does not yet exist on your call reports. You haven't been asked to calculate this on your call reports. You will be starting on January 1st. There'll be a new line item on the 5300. It won't be in your ACL. It won't be a contra asset account to your loan portfolio. It will be in the other liabilities section of the call report. And it will be called a total ACL for off-balance sheet credit exposures or something like that. Once you have that, this is where you would do that calculation. And again, it's a pretty small piece of the puzzle, so it's not something I'd spend weeks pulling your hair out about, but we have given you some guidance here on how to manage that. And then that plays in, it flows through to the summary tab right here. Once we've taken all that into account, we know what your total CECL requirement is going to be. We can compare it to your current reserve at any given point in time using the current methodologies and let you know, hey, as of today, as of this point in time, you have a surplus or you have a shortfall of X dollars. That's pretty much where your examiners and your auditors need you to be now, before the end of this year. They're asking the following questions right now. Do you know how you're going to tackle CECL, right? Do you have a methodology in mind? Have you started running that methodology in parallel? Do you have an idea of how much shortfall or surplus you're going to have on day one? Day one being on January 1st, or whenever you do your first call report or internal statements after January 1st, you're going to make a day one adjustment on your balance sheet to take your current reserve and make it a quote CECL approved reserve, right? Or a CECL methodology reserve. And that day one accounting will bypass the income statement completely. It'll be an adjustment going to or from the reserve and your undivided profits, or retained earnings. And after day one, once you've made that one-time adjustment saying, hey, I'm 100,000 short on my reserve from a CECL perspective. So on day one in January, we did a $100,000 one-time transfer from equity into the reserve. Now, at this point, our reserve is a CECL approved, ACL or allowance for credit losses. Then from day two on, we will manage it exactly the same way as we do currently, right? We provision on the income statement, and that is what enters the reserve, and then charge-offs exit the reserve as they do today. So hopefully that helps from kind of a day one perspective versus a day two and beyond perspective. But once we've done all that, that's pretty much how the tool works on a step-by-step basis. If just a couple notes on managing the tool here. Once you've got a scenario the way you want it, you want to make sure you save that scenario, give it a name, give it a date, so that you know when it was as of. As soon as you've done that, it'll be saved here in this drop-down box securely on our servers. Everything that you plugged in, all the numbers, all the notes will be saved as of that point in time and frozen as of that point in time. You can save as many scenarios as you want. We're not charging by the scenario or by the user for that matter. And so best practice, every time you change something, every time some new information comes in, you should be saving it as a new scenario. You shouldn't have one scenario that you keep overwriting and saving over each month or each quarter, right? Because then you have no historical trends. Then you can't look back and say, hey, 6 months ago, it looked like this, but this is what's been changing over the last 6 months, and this is why it looks like this now. So you want to provide that paper trail. You want to have those historically accurate calculations so you can see what direction your reserve from a CECL perspective has been going in, right? And you can demonstrate that to your examiners as well. So save scenarios as new each time. You can export once you've got it the way you like it, depending on your audience. Certainly, if you're just giving a quick summary to your board, you don't need all the nitty gritty. You can just export a summary tab, or if you're sending it to your auditors, I'm sure they're going to want all the nitty gritty, and then you can select. You have full control over what data and how much that you save or export with the tool when you're sharing it outside or inside your organization. And so let's say we wanted the summary, we wanted the historical detail and peer data, then we wanted some of those Q factors, and maybe we wanted some economic data, and we want that as a PDF. So we picked and choose what we wanted, said we wanted it exported as a PDF. It'll pop right up as a separate tab here right in your browser within a few seconds. Bear with me. I've got some Google Fiber is finally entering our neighborhood to give us some better internet connection here, but that means that in the meantime, they're digging up everybody's front yard and our internet connection is horrible. So bear with me as it loads that. But you can also export the tool into an Excel environment if you so desire. So you can take, the nice thing about the Excel export is that it pulls the entire tool into an Excel environment and retains all the spacing and shading and formatting so that you can come right into the Excel tool. And I think it's now finally pulling up my PDF as well. Here we go. Here's the PDF export. There's the summary tab that we pulled up. There's the notes that we made on the all other unsecured that we netted out some fully share secured loans. So the notes get attached as well. Here's all the historical data with the visual look back periods is all in there if you wanted it. Here's the peer data trends. Here are those qualitative factor adjustments and any notes that we made on our Q factors or narratives. And here are some of those economic trends. So it all gets exported to PDF, or if you so desire, I'll open up the Excel export. As you see here, the Excel export has all the formatting, spacing and visual formatting, so that if you want to add a column, if you want to add a row, do some additional calculations or explanations, you can do all that right here in the Excel export, and then you can make additional charts or any other visuals that you see fit in the Excel export. So multiple ways you can get that data and do what you need to do with it. A note about peer groups. So I know I kind of jumped right over or kind of glazed by the peer data. Peer data is going to be critical in any CECL analysis. And it's for some of the reasons that David already alluded to, and I think I mentioned earlier, and that was you're going to have some segments of your portfolio where you just don't have much loss recently, and you're still going to need to justify a significant reserve on it. And it's going to be hard to do so with just your own history. So you can say, hey, listen, we looked at all our new vehicle loans. We analyzed our portfolio over the last decade, and we just don't have much in the way of losses. But we're not going to be that aggressive and it's just assume that we're going to continue having no losses. We want to be more conservative here. So we analyzed not just our new vehicle loan losses, we analyzed every single other similar size credit union in our state or our region and looked at their experience just in new vehicle loans and saw what their trends look like. And so if we did this historical analysis, right, this thing that we did for you guys with all this historical data over these custom look back periods, if we were to do this exact same complete analysis on every single other credit union in your state that's in your asset size range, and then average them all out, that's in fact exactly what we've done. And this is what it would look like. So this is crunching literally millions and millions of call report values to tell you of all the similar sized credit unions in your neck of the woods, what were the average loss rate trends over time for each of those segments, using the same apples to apples segments as we're using for you. So this is a great indicator of the environment outside your four walls. That certainly should be one of your critical qualitative factor adjustments. And so we present all this data. We allow you to change your peer groups. If you want to zoom in on just your state, right now this is the national peer group 6. So this is, and when I say peer group 6, these are the NCUA's peer groups. We wanted the peer group data to have some familiarity with our examiners and our auditors. So we started by saying, hey, let's use the NCUA's, their own peer groups. How do they kind of organize credit unions by group and compare performance? And the NCUA they're pretty straightforward. They've got 6 peer groups by asset size. The smallest is peer group 1. Those are the guys under 2 million in assets, all the way up to peer group 6, which is everybody over $500 million in total assets. So you can choose your peer group, your size range, or you can go up or down a size range if you want to see what kind of losses smaller or larger credit unions in your neck of the woods have. If I put my analyst hat on, I could have a field day with just this page playing around with it. Or if you want to zoom in on just your state, so I'm clicking on state, and now instead of looking at all the $500 million credit unions in the country, now these are average loss rates for just the $500 million and above credit unions in the state of Wisconsin. So it's up to you, your geographic scope of your choice, or which asset group you want to use as your peer comparison. But it will default to your appropriate NCUA peer group and then allow you to modify it. At this point, I think I've pointed out just about everything that I wanted to on the interactive tool here. We have some resources that we always offer to help you get through using the tool. There's a user guide here, which is a visual user guide that takes you step by step as to how to use the tool and what some best practices are. It's a great refresher if you're a current customer but you haven't looked at it in 6 months, or if you're just got some new people that you're onboarding at the credit union and you want to get them to get a head start on understanding how to use the tool. This is a great resource. This is a quick and dirty kind of a 2-page or 1-page methodology guide that explains the WARM methodology and how we utilize it. A white paper that we authored, some draft policy language for an implementation letter. Those are the types of things that your examiners always love to see shoved in a folder somewhere, that you've done some of this policy language, and so we give you some help there drafting that. This is another link to that Excel-based WARM estimator if you need some assistance on calculating your WARMs. This is some guidance on prepayments to be used in conjunction with your WARM calculations that we provide, and we have some more prepayment and WARM guidance that just came out from the NCUA in the last month that we're going to be adding here as well. And then for your due diligence process, for those of you who need, we have a SOC 1 report that we've done on the tool so that you know the model has been validated, and that's there just for your edification. And then some of the other external accounting resources and NCUA guides that discuss CECL in general and the WARM method more specifically. So at this point, I'm going to hand it back over screen sharing to David. I'm going to walk through a couple more slides real quick, and then David will sort of take it home for us. I know I just went through, so David, if you want to take the screen back, and let me see here. See if I can, there we go. I know we didn't, I shared all these screens as part of the interactive tool here online, but I wanted to have some actual screenshots of the tool in the PowerPoint presentation so that when we send it to all of you after the call, you'd have some pages that you can print off and share internally. So David, if you can share the PowerPoint presentation again.
Steve, can you see it?
No, still it's just showing the background for the webinar today. It's not showing your screen yet. It's just waiting to view your screen.
Let me make myself the presenter again.
So the next few slides, here we go. So these slides are just kind of a summary of what I've just gone over so that you have it in black and white on your PDF that we're going to send out after the call today. So we don't need to go through these as I've already talked about them. So flip to the next one, flip to the next one, flip to the next one. Yeah, those are those common Q factors. That's the individually assessed loans tab. You can skip ahead a couple more, David. HTM securities, peer data. So we've also added into the tool the ability, and this is just a kind of a freebie that we want. Since we were aggregating all the call report data from every credit union on the planet, we figured, why don't we offer some of that data and make it available for you guys? Because we had lots of requests to be able to see some basic financial data on our customers' credit unions and on peer credit unions, outside the scope of just credit-related data. So this is a newer tool that's available for free for all of our CECL subscribers. Allows you to go in there and take a look over different historical periods and see some basic financial overview, performance, asset quality, loan mix, deposit mix, asset quality, everything else for your credit union or for any other credit union in the country. So you can actually click on the search box and search for any credit union you want, see where their branches are, and see what their financial performance looks like. And on the next slide, David, this is another tool that we added in there called Credit Union Universe at a Glance. This just kind of gives you an idea of who the other credit unions around you are. So if you're asking, hey, I'm in NCUA Peer Group 4 and I'm in Texas, who are the other, Texas credit unions that are in my peer group that I'm actually comparing myself to using your CECL tool? You can come right here. You can click on your state of Texas, and then you can sort all the credit unions by asset size, and you can see exactly which 20, 30, 50, 70 credit unions are in your asset bucket and in your state or your region, and get a feel for what they look like, how big they are, how they performed, what type of loans they have, everything else. So it's a great little filtering tool or just background research tool that we wanted to make available. Certainly it's exportable, it's printable, just like everything else on our platform. Next slide. So this is something I'm only going to take a second on. I know we're all very familiar with it at this point. I'm sure you guys are. We all had that shock to our system, or anyone on this call that's prepared a call report or has that duty, unenviable duty for your credit union. On March 31st, there was a massive overhaul to the credit union data for everything asset quality related, right? This is just a kind of a summary of what all those changes were. It's actually helpful from a CECL perspective because we now have some more commercial segments that are discrete and not memo items than we used to have. The challenge is we have before March 31st buckets and we have after March 31st buckets. And we're trying to find long-term loss trends. And so that's where the challenge comes. So we spent a lot of time and more than a few gray hairs to make sure that we mapped all the call report data from before the change to after the change so that we can still get our best estimate of long-term loss rates on buckets, even if the composition of the buckets have changed slightly in the call reports. So on the next slide, you'll get an idea of what that looks like. The old call reports on the left had 9 total additive buckets of loans, and everything else was a memo item. Now, all that red stuff on the right are all completely new segments that didn't exist until March 31st when it comes to charge-offs and recoveries and everything else. So a lot of new data that we're certainly taking into account. I've seen a lot of other tools that were built before this change, and they don't reflect the new, more granular, better, more accurate call report segments. And you want to make sure, this is just kind of a cautionary tale, no matter what direction you go with CECL, whether you use our tool or a competitor's or do it internally, you need to be trying to take advantage of all the segmentation that we now have on the call reports, even though it's more challenging to do so, because we need that granularity to be as precise as we need to be from CECL. On the next slide, you'll see all the delinquent loan data, right? Which gives you an idea of where charge-offs might be headed. All the red stuff on this page is new. So 80% of asset quality data on the call reports were completely changed in March 31st of this year. So it was a big deal for us and a big deal from the NCUA. And the timing was, I would say, less than ideal, but we don't make those decisions. On the next slide, I think I wanted to point out, yeah, so this is just a little bit more detail on warm values and prepayment assumptions. So in order to get the ball rolling for CECL, I mentioned that you have to have some warm estimates, right? But that's, of course, the most labor and time intensive part of the whole process is doing that loan level, using the loan level data to get your warm estimates. If you want to get some sort of a concept or feel for where you are from a CECL perspective, and you don't have the time to do all the detailed warm work before you want to get some estimate, we now have some more guidance that we can provide so you can plug in some default warm values that won't be perfectly accurate. That'll certainly be better, though, than just a mindless plug in order to get you in the right direction. So if you flip to the next screen, here is some data. This is some data that the NCUA just came out with where they took internal data from credit unions around the country that obviously the NCUA has access to, and was able to do a proprietary study where they did some warm calculations by default or by call report segment and some estimated kind of industry average annual prepayment speed. So this is some great data. Wish we had it a year and a half ago from the NCUA, but I would say better late than never. And so we certainly thank them when they made this available recently and prodded them for a long time to do so. So this is a great starting point before you start using your own data. But ideally, you're going to want to use your own loan level data to calculate WARMs. Using industry averages like this is a good way to start, but I just don't think it's going to get the job done. It may satisfy the NCUA if you're really small. I highly doubt it's going to satisfy your auditors in the long run, but it's a good starting point. On the next slide, we give you some guidance on some additional guidance on prepayment data, since it's such a challenging thing to really get a gauge on. So here's some information from the FHFA that can give you some guidance on prepayment speeds for mortgage-related loans. On the next slide, we show you what that sort of looks like over the long run. There's a chart right there. And on the next slide, we give you some information about other loans, non-mortgage related loans, and where to start from a prepayment standpoint. I wouldn't say this data has been superseded by what we got from the NCUA just more recently, but it's certainly additional information that can back up whatever assumptions you feel like you need to make from a CECL perspective. Next slide. And we'll just go over this just very briefly. These are just some steps. If on the next slide, David, just reminding you, what the process is. Once, let's say you've subscribed to our tool, you did your first parallel run, you thought in detail about all your qualitative factor adjustments, you made lots of notes, you have a fully fleshed out scenario, and now it's just a month or a quarter later, and you're like, well, what do I have to do on an ongoing basis, to make new scenarios? It's very straightforward. You might need to update your WARMs. Depends on how long it's been since last time you ran a CECL scenario. And then you're going to roll the historical data forward, making sure you capture anything new that's come from the call reports. If a new quarter has passed, we'll have new data for the entire industry and new historical data for your credit union already loaded into the system. You'll revisit your Q factors. You'll just double check all the assumptions you made, all the notes you made, read your little narratives and see if there's anything that's really changed since the last time you ran it. You'll update your balances with current balances and then check on your individual assessments. And that's pretty much it. Once you've done that, you now have an updated CECL scenario for the next month or the next quarter. And you save it in our tool and then export it and you're off and running. I believe, David, that was all that I had to cover today. Do we have anything else on the, nope. So why don't you go ahead and take us home.
All right, so we have roughly 300 credit unions. I believe more now. I think we're closer to 400 at this point. We'll have to revisit that number. Most of which are using us to calculate their WARMs, which is what Steve was just talking about a few moments ago. So again, this is the data that we need from you, which most of it comes from your Aries file. We need some slightly different data for credit cards and lines of credit, but it's just a way to making sure that we can map your data correctly. We also need some sort of loan key from you, but any kind of support that you need, you have from myself, you have from Steve, you have from what we call our QA team. And your next steps, if you are interested in finding out a little bit more, if today wasn't interesting enough for you, we have more. We certainly can do a live tour for you where myself or Jason Heinrich will walk you through it with your specific numbers, basically your 5300 charge-off data, your recovery data, everything that's in the 5300 as well as your loan population, dollar amounts, and just kind of walk you through a specific scenario with some educated guesses at WARM numbers, as well as putting in some qualitative factor adjustments in there so we can see somewhat of a reserve calculation for you and where it's looking like for you, where the end result would end up for your credit union specifically. Also, in those conversations, we talk a little bit more in depth about pricing, because in these webinars, as you might imagine, there are credit unions that are very small to the very large attending, and we do base our pricing for CECLSolver on your asset size. So it would be as simple as reaching out to us and just saying, hey, I watched the webinar today. or on the 25th, and I would love to get some pricing just to get a little bit more information. And then obviously any questions that you have, we can certainly answer those as well. We have a coffee talk, which is basically an educational session for our credit unions. We have the topic that we make available for you. We have guests, CPAs. We've been trying to get some regulators on as well, and we'll continue to try on that. But again, these coffee talks are educational in nature. The first 10 minutes or so, Steve usually discusses, again, kind of a review for CECLSolver, but then we get into specific topics where the credit unions themselves can ask questions for their specific scenario. And again, it's just a great way to get more information out about CECL in general. So I highly suggest signing up for that. Even if you sign up for it and you are not able to attend, we will send you the recording. Our next one is November 18th at 11:30 a.m. Eastern time. The webinar, this PowerPoint will contain the register link for it, which I believe is a Zoom meeting. So again, attend that. If you do nothing else, it'll be good for getting a little bit more information on CECL as well as CECLSolver. Before we finish, let's see if we have any submitted questions today. It does not look like it. So with that said, we would just like to say thank you for attending today. We really appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to talk about CECL. And with that said, Steve, thank you very much for today, and thank you all for attending. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Yep, thanks for joining us.